to the British beginnings at colonization. Now, at the last PowerPoint, we briefly discussed the beginnings of colonization, looking at the British. We looked more at the back history of the economic and social reasons why the British wanted to colonize, but we focused more on the Spanish colonization. So through this PowerPoint, we're going to focus solely on the British. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first permanent English settlements were mostly because of business enterprises. They are small, fragile communities that were unprepared for the hardships that they were to face. And as Europeans attempted to isolate themselves from the Native Americans and create enclosed societies that were wholly their own, really transplants of the English world that they left behind. However, they found a world filled with many different cultures, both Native Americans, the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch. And so what we're really going to focus on is start to look at the colonists in the early Chesapeake area. So first we're going to look at Jamestown. Now this is an artistic drawing of what Jamestown would have looked like. Now today Jamestown, actually part of the fort is actually underwater. However, we're going to go ahead and so when we talk about Jamestown, think of this picture. So King James I, who united both England and Scotland, is going to send 144 people. And when I say 144 people, they're actually 144 men. 104 are going to survive the journey to the Chesapeake through sailing over the ocean. They're going to choose to settle inland as they believed it would give them security from the Native Americans. However, that really gave them more danger because they're further into the Native American territory. They're not just on the coast. So months later, after they arrive, men and other supplies are going to arrive from England. They are going to be vulnerable to local diseases such as malaria. They're going to focus less on growing food and building a community, and more focused on finding gold and other exports, which is going to make it harder for them to raise food because they did not create a real community because there's no women. Historically, men were in charge of hunting, of building. Women's work was more of creating the home, cooking, cleaning, washing, and there's no women at Jamestown. And so these settlers are going to survive with learning from the Native American communities around them on just really how to live, how to grow food, how to cook food. And this is not food that the English are used to. This is squash and beans and corn and agriculture, because you can't grow the same food that you did in England. In North America, that the soil is different, the acidity is different, and it's a harsh lesson that they're going to have to learn. Now, the English thought that the Native Americans were hostile to them and that they were, quote, savages, because the English had sea vessels, they had muskets, they had advanced weapons. However, the survival of Jamestown was the result of the English learning agricultural technologies from the Native Americans. By the time more men and women arrived at Jamestown, only 38 men of the original 144 that set sail from England were alive. Jamestown survived by learning from the Native Americans and their leader, Captain John Smith. He imposed a work and order on the community. If you wanted to eat, you had to work, no matter what status you had, no matter what rank you had. And he really cultivated a relationships with the Native Americans as well. Now, before we discuss Bacon's Rebellion, we need to first discuss what really happens after Jamestown? Well, the London Company, which is later renamed the Virginia Company, is going to obtain a new charter in 1609 from the king to increase its power and territory. And it's going to offer stock in the company to planters who are willing to move to these new colonies at their own expense. It's also going to provide free passage to Virginia for poor people who would agree to work for the company for 7 years. We call this term is indentured servitude. So you would work for a certain amount of years to pay off your debt. Now, those that did come over are going to suffer from disease, troubles of weather, such as hurricanes. Hurricanes aren't really an issue within England, but they are within Virginia. Now, the Native Americans realized that the English were a threat and cut off their expansion into the area, and so they were unable to hunt or to cultivate food. So, what do you do from here? Well, as more and more people come over, there's going to be more and more settlements are going to start lining the river. Now, why is that? Well, historically, when you look at settlements, no matter what country or what region you look at, they tend to be near water. And you might wonder, well, why is that? Well, simply that's because the soil is better. The soil has nutrients in it. It's easy to grow food that is closer to a water source. It's also easier to get fresh water for hydration. And another reason, particular with looking at Virginia, is that the colonists are going to really discover a new crop, tobacco, which is going to be the first profitable crop in the New World. Now you have to remember that prior to the use of tobacco as a cash crop, the Virginia colony was really a failure. It wasn't producing money. And so with the discovery of tobacco in the New World, this crop is going to encourage farmers to travel more inland, which is going to be problematic because they're going to be running into native farmlands. So now we're going to continue to have English men and women come over from England to Virginia. And this includes iron workers and other skilled craftsmen to Virginia, along with actually 100 English women, whose purpose was simply to marry the English men who had already landed in Virginia to populate this settlement, this first colony. Now there is going to be a various amounts of attacks between Native Americans and the English, and these Native Americans within Virginia are the Powhatan Native Americans. And so within Virginia's first 40 years, you're going to have roughly 8,500 white settlers are going to arrive in the colony, and 80% of them are going to die. Only 1,700 are actually going to survive in the first 80 years. And that's just Virginia. So now we're going to look at Maryland. Maryland and the Calverts. So George Calvert, C-A-L-V-E-R-T, George Calvert is the first Lord of Baltimore, and he envisioned a land of refuge for English Catholics. Now there's going to be an act of religious toleration in 1649 called Now, this act of religious toleration in 1649 is simply called Act Concerning Religion. However, there is still going to be this tension in Maryland for the Catholic minority and the Protestant majority. And Maryland is going to become the center for tobacco production, which is extremely significant. And now we're going to move on to talking about Bacon's Rebellion, which is the picture you see before you. Now, there's really two people at play here. There's Sir William Berkeley, which, if you look at the painting, is the person to the right. So the two players, when you look at Bacon's Rebellion, is Sir William Berkeley, which is the gentleman in the right in the painting, and Nathaniel Bacon, which is the gentleman to the left in that same painting. So Sir William Berkeley, he is the Royal Governor of Virginia, and he is going to be the Royal Governor of Virginia from 1642 to 1677. And he is going to help open up the interior of Virginia by sending explorers across the Blue Ridge Mountains. He is known as getting the praise for crushing a Native American uprising, and he agreed that the English would have the land east of those mountains. Now, this is going to provide difficulty as the population of Virginia is going to grow from around 8,000 to 40,000 people in just 20 years, between 1640 and 1660. He also expanded his powers and his authority. He's going to limit the vote for delegates once open to all white men to just landowners, which, remember, it's expensive to own land even in the Virginia colony. Elections are going to be rare. The same people were often in office, and the settlers became more and more underrepresented. And there's going to be resentment for those in office. It's going to grow and grow. Now, Nathaniel Bacon, he resented Governor Berkeley's attempt to hold the boundary line. Bacon wanted to move further west. However, Berkeley was afraid of further settlement for the fear of antagonizing the Native Americans. He also didn't like that Berkeley controlled the profitable fur trade, which Bacon wanted a piece of. Both men were frontier aristocrats, and so tensions are going to grow because of indentured servants who, once they were free, were left with virtually no money and no home. And so in 1675, a fight is going to erupt between the Native Americans and the English settlers. And Bacon is asked the militia to be sent in, and Berkeley says no. Bacon organizes a volunteer army against the Native Americans. When Berkeley heard about this, proclaimed Bacon and his men to be rebels. So Bacon turned his men against Berkeley and twice led his troops east of Jamestown. And for the first time, the governor pardoned Bacon, but the second time Bacon burned much of the city and drove Berkeley into exile. However, then Bacon suddenly died and Berkeley came back into power. And in 1677, the Native Americans signed a new treaty that opened new lands on white settlement. Now, if you look at this painting here, so you have Berkeley on the right and you have Bacon on the left. This is one of the early examples of propaganda within United States history. Did this actually happen with two groups of men where Berkeley is to the right and all the well-to-do dressed people are on the right-hand side with a nice building, and then Bacon is on the left with the shrubbery and the trees and the disheveled men behind him? No, that's virtually impossible. That's just really symbolizing these two men's backgrounds and perhaps even their employments and what they're in charge of doing. It's really interesting to look at that. And then the map to the left kind of shows you Bacon's rebellion as well. And so why talk about this? Well, simply, this is extremely significant because it's elaborating on the overall narrative of what's happening here. So why should we pay attention to Bacon's rebellion? Well, simply this is extremely significant because these individuals left England, left this rigid society that told certain people of certain backgrounds, you may not own land, your vote may not count. And they traveled thousands of miles to come to this new world, to have new dangers put around them. And now the society is starting to come up again. You're having people from various backgrounds, particularly wealthy, that have connections with the king, who are now telling people that their opinion doesn't matter, their vote doesn't matter, and to pretty much just shut up and do what they are told. And now people are starting to fight back. And And Nathaniel Bacon is one of these individuals. So it's important to put that in the back front of your mind that even though they leave this society that has really constrained their growth, now it's really starting to show that itself again within the New World. So now we're gonna focus. We're gonna move up north. So this is strictly looking at Virginia. Now we're going to move up north to look at the growth of New England. So let's look at the Puritans. Now in 1620, the Puritans are going to sail on the Mayflower and settle into an area north of Cape Cod called Plymouth. The Mayflower Compact is going to establish a government for the Puritans, and during their first winter, half of the colonists are going to die from malnutrition, disease, and exposure to those elements. And so the Native Americans in that area is going to show them how to cultivate food and how to establish a fur trade. And this is really where we get the first Thanksgiving is during this time period. Very, very significant. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the Massachusetts Bay experiment before I talk about the English Civil War. So the Massachusetts Bay Company is going to create a colony. So they sail in 1630 with 17 ships, 1,000 people, and it's going to become the largest single migration of the 17th century. And they're going to establish the port of Boston and several other cities in that time. So what does the expansion of New England look like? Well, they're going to expand into the Connecticut River Valley, Rhode Island, New York, New Hampshire, and Maine, mostly for religious toleration. They didn't like the way someone was leading a particular community. They'd simply just leave and settle somewhere else. This is really how vast and how open the territory of New England is at this time. Now that's 1630, all right? Now, when we talk about Bacon's Rebellion, that's 1675. So now talking about, that area, 1675, but we're looking more at New England, we're actually going to have our first war. And it's important to talk about this war because it affects technology. So we're going to talk about King Philip's War. And this is a conflict that is going to be between English settlers and the Pequot Native Americans, also known as the Pequot War, Pequot. And this is in 1675. So the Wampanoag tribe, which is led by Metacomet, is going to try to resist the English. And for 3 years, the tribe is going to inflict terror on a string of Massachusetts towns, killing over 1,000 people. Now, in early 1676, white settlers gradually prevailed with the help of a group of Mohawk allies who ambushed Metacomet and killed him. Therefore, the fragile alliance of these tribes is going to collapse, and the white settlers are almost wiped the Wampanoag tribe out. So why is it important to discuss this war? Well, it's really important to discuss not only the relationships between these tribes and the English settlers, but also the technology that comes out of it. So you're going to have the advance of the flintlock rifle, and you're going to have the Native Americans learn how to handle these rifles and even repair them. So that's very interesting because not only do you have these tribes who you have come onto their land and you're taking their land, but you are now arming them with the same technology that you have, and they know the land so much better than you that they are acquiring more weapons to defend themselves if so they need to. It's very important to realize that. So now let's focus on the English Civil War, which is this slide right here. And this really comes down to really two people. So you have Charles I, who is on the left-hand side. And then you have Oliver Cromwell, who is on the right-hand side. So Charles I is going to dissolve Parliament from 1629 to 1640. That is a long time. That is 11 years. And then asked, so not only did Charles I dissolve Parliament from 1629 to 1640, he then asked it to levy new taxes, then he dismissed them twice, and so therefore Parliament organized a military force, and that was the start of the English Civil War. Now the conflict arose between two groups, between the Cavaliers, those who supported the king, and the Roundheads, those of Parliament, who are mostly Puritans. And this conflict is going to last for 7 years. Now the Roundheads defeated the king's forces and ended up beheading Charles I. And Oliver Cromwell assumed the role as, quote, the protector. However, when he died and his son was seen to be unfit, Charles II, the son of the beheaded monarch, returned from exile and seized the throne. And this is known as the Restoration. So what are the results of the Restoration? Well, rewarded faithful courtiers of land were given land grants in the New World. There were charters that were issued within the next 25 years for Carolina, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and he supported religious toleration, which means that he let Catholicism back into the country. So the English Civil War was long and sad, but it resulted in some really important aspects when you look at the whole narrative of early American history. All right, so now we are going to discuss the borderlands before we talk about the Navigation Acts. So what are the borderlands? The borderlands are the middle grounds. And these are very important islands, as it were. These are particularly Caribbean islands, and this includes Antigua, St. Kitts, Jamaica, Barbados. Now, within the islands, they were unsuccessful at growing cotton and tobacco, just because it was too hot. So the most lucrative crop is going to be sugar, and sugarcane also could distill into rum, for which there was a booming market abroad. And because sugar was so labor intensive, they started to import labor. The enslaved African force completely changes our world within North America in the Western Hemisphere. So what does it mean to be a master or a slave within the Caribbean? Well, they meaning the masters, watch the slaves carefully. They're really afraid of a revolt because there's so many slaves compared to masters, which is why they were treated so horribly, to instigate that fear to make them behave. Now, many have concluded that it would be cheaper to buy new slaves periodically than to protect the well-being of those they already owned, and so they would work them to death. Africans usually only lasted a decade or so in this harsh working environments and harsh working conditions. Africans that did work and lived in the islands established a culture. They had families, they had religion, they had social traditions, and they established patterns of resistance. Now, when you look at the southwest borderlands, these are going to be the Spanish colonies. So this is Florida, Texas, Louisiana, I'm sorry, not Louisiana, Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Now, it is important to realize Florida actually extended all the way to Louisiana. It's a huge, huge chunk of land. Now, Spanish colonists attracted religious missionaries, Catholic missionaries, and independent ranchers. And their greatest threat was the French in the 1680s with the claiming of Louisiana. And Louisiana is not the Louisiana state we think of. It is a vast land that stretches all the way up to the border of Canada. Now, lastly, there are some other borderlands to the southeast. Now, remember, there's going to be a conflict between the Spanish and the English on the east coast and on the inland. Georgia was actually used as the boundary between the Carolinas, the English Carolinas, and the Spanish Florida. It's going to be a constant struggle. And the English aren't going to acquire Florida until after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. So when we talk about the middle grounds, we're talking about really the fight for North America, the Spanish, the English, the French, the Dutch, the fight for power, the fight for relationships within the Native Americans, and the British settlers that were dominant in the middle grounds. It's very important to have that perspective that you have all of these European powers in really a small kind of area, particularly within New England. There's a big open ground when you look at the Carolinas and Virginia and Maryland, but when you look at the two conflicting areas, that's really when you get to the southeast and to the northeast. So now let's continue on and let's talk about these navigation acts. Now there are really 3 navigation acts that I want to discuss, and I'm just going to simply tell you what they are. In the slide before you, this is just a really small snippet of the first Navigation Act. And so I'm just going to briefly tell you what these 3 acts are. So the first Navigation Act is in 1660, and it closed the colonies to all trade except English ships. Now the British also required that tobacco and other items be exported from the colonies only to England or to English possessions. The second Navigation Act in 1663 required all goods sent from Europe to the colonies pass through England on the way, where they would be taxed. And the third Navigation Act, which is in 1673, imposed duties on the coastal trade among the English colonies, and it provided for the appointment of custom officials to enforce these acts. So when you look at the Dominion of New England, there's various entities that we need to be aware of. So in 1675, King George is going to create the Lords of Trade to make recommendations for imperial reform. 4 years later, in 1679, the king is going to move to increase his control over Massachusetts and is going to strip it over control over New Hampshire and chartered a separate royal colony there and chose a governor. And within 5 years after that, in 1684, proclaiming the colony's assembly defiance of the Navigation Acts, he revokes Massachusetts charter. And so King Charles II's brother, James II, is going to succeed him in 1685 and create a single dominion of New England. So what does that mean? That means he is going to combine all the governments of New England and going to appoint one governor over them all. Typically, you would have a governor for each colony, but not with James II. And this is really going to frustrate these colonists. And around this time is where we have the Glorious Revolution, which we're going to go to the next slide to discuss. So what is this Glorious Revolution? Well, simply, there is a fear of James II, who is openly Catholic, this great fear in England, fear of the Pope taking over the country, because if you're Catholic, who is the most influential person within your life? That would be the Pope. So in 1688, Parliament voted to force James II out, who showed no resistance to giving up the crown, aware of his grandfather's beheading. So his daughter, James II's daughter Mary, and her husband William, both Protestants, replaced James II to reign jointly. And so with them coming into the throne, what are the results of that? Well, simply, it's going to abolish the Dominion of New England, and it's going to restore separate governments within New England, and it's going to replace church membership with property ownership as the basis for voting and office holding, which is going to be really significant because now you have individuals who can now have a vote. All you have to be is in church. And the vast majority of the population within these colonies are Protestant or Catholic. There wasn't really atheists. A lot of people probably were atheists and weren't, strong believers, but they didn't come out and say that blatantly because being a Protestant or being a Catholic was much more of a family tie, of a communal tie. And so having just church membership is huge for the end of this glorious revolution, because now people feel like they have a vote, they have a say, their opinion matters. They don't have to be wealthy and own land. All they have to do is what they've been doing their whole life, which is just be part of a church. And so this concludes this lecture.